Hey everybody, this is Carlos Salon, founder and CEO of G2 Esports, former professional gamer, and wonderful bodybuilder, as you may have known. Of course, you know me for that, pretty sure. And you're watching Dankan's channel. Thorin, my man. Enjoy.
Right, this is going to be episode 18 of Esports Salon, assuming when I Googled the number, there wasn't actually a number 18 that didn't appear immediately, in which case it's to look foolish, but whatever. It doesn't really matter what exact number it is, does it? It's not a TV show. You don't have to have watched all the other 17 episodes. So for this episode, highly anticipated one, because it's going to be talking about the intricacies of contract law, specifically in the state of California. So I know you're all incredibly interested by that, aren't you? It sounds really boring until I mention that it involves FaZe streamers. So obviously it's the most pertinent thing of all fucking esports right now. So, okay, the panel for this one, we'll go in anti-clockwise fashion for this one, just because it's funnier if they don't all know what order they're in, you know. So because it's a legal topic, we've got in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got Bryce Blum, aka Esports Law, who is a founding partner of ESG Law and does a whole bunch of other business stuff now. So that's how you know he's actually like really made it in esports. He's got all the cronies across all them. He's got his fingers in all the pies now. That's what I like. He started out just doing the contracts, but now he's got everything going. So good to start with. Then we've got in the other box at the bottom, we've got Ryan Morrison, who is... What's your official title? It's founding partner of... Now it's Morrison Rothman, I noticed. That's different from what it used to be, right? And then also, again, a bunch of other different things, obviously talent agency, etc. So finally, rounding out the panel is obviously Richard Lewis, veteran esports journalist, fellow...
Someone who has no right being
fellow esports journalist of the year award winner. Just a way to humble brag myself winning the award there. Even though it's totally irrelevant. And
I think we all won except Bryce, right?
Wow.
Right. Okay, I see. Oh, you won talent agency or agent?
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Okay. It's all right. Your time will come, Bryce. Your time will come.
That's how seriously he took it.
Listen, I can't talk shit on that. I was there myself for the other one, so...
No, he wasn't. Ryan wasn't.
Oh, he wasn't there, right?
No, he ghosted it.
But Duncan gave us the award. He gave it to Chris and Sebastian.
True.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. After saying
a sick grandmother. I had a good excuse. Sick grandmother.
Right, first of all, to start with, and by the way, Richard, you definitely aren't an irrelevant member of this crew. I mean, a lot of people watching this episode immediately think you're basically like the armed muscle that I've brought in for this particular episode after setting up these two gentlemen. Yeah, basically. That was a joke to set it up to, the double bluff to distract them at the beginning, though, Rich. So, okay. And I will say, to be fair, for people who are wondering, this is a legal topic. Richard did actually post on his Twitter about 4 days ago, one of the most horrific tweets I've ever seen, as someone who enjoys research and journalism, where he just posted some light reading recently, and it just was the cover to a PDF for California labor law. And it was a 500-page document. It's well, God bless.
Yeah, it was not a lot of fun. I don't know how these lawyer types do it, honestly.
Yeah, welcome to the life, my friend.
Yeah.
Brutal.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Okay. To start off with, I just have a question. I'm a factual guy. I like to know the parameters of a discussion before I start. So I actually just genuinely want to know the answer to this question. So either of you can answer it out of Bryce and Ryan here, which is, you said that collectively, Bryce, you probably rep 75% of the teams. And then Ryan did say something like he reps more players than anyone or someone. So collectively, how do those two things work? One of you is mainly teams and one of you is mainly players or something?
Yeah, long time ago. So with the attorneys' rules comes conflict of interest rules. So if I was repping teams and players, or Bryce was repping teams and players, very quickly we'd be representing both sides of an argument.
Absolutely, yeah.
Can't do that. Bryce focuses on teams. I focus on players. We've both done both throughout our histories.
Sure.
Gale Force Esports, I was their attorney for a while, and things like, we never made it to the tier ones, which is why I'm not conflicted out of working with just about any org. We've certainly done more player contracts than anyone around, and Bryce certainly reps more teams than anyone around.
Okay. Right, along those lines then, because obviously that is an interesting distinction going forwards in this discussion. So I'll just set the parameters for people who don't remember, because it was maybe a month ago now. A lot of this interesting discussion around contracts came out of this dispute where the very popular Fortnite streamer Ttfue, who was a member of FaZe Clan, came forwards, revealed details of his contract, claimed that his contract stipulated that FaZe Clan received 80% of any endorsement or deal they got for him and that he would only get 20%, which obviously, even to someone who's a layman, sounds outrageous and people will think, wow, is that really true? true. Then there was, like, to be fair, there's a lot of details to this story. We're not going to run through them all here. Like, for example, it turned out that they never actually had taken the 80% supposedly of any deals. They actually hadn't got him any of that. He'd been paid at a normal rate, and in the meantime, they had offered him other contracts, which he also didn't initially mention. But again, it was a clusterfuck of slowly details being drip fed out and then coming in kind of a rush. So the place I want to start, though, before we go into the specifics of some of that case, if you want to draw on that as an example that is in people's minds, the first question I have, and this is not meant to sound like an ambush, it just is. So it goes like this. To the two lawyers in the call, this is the question, gentlemen, is under any other normal circumstances, if someone asked me something about esports law, I would recommend them to one of you two, or I would say these are people who've been in the space very long. Ask them about a contract setup, or get them to write your contract, or get them to check your contract if you're going to a team. So people, I think, naturally in the community are going to wonder, if this is so egregious as it sounds, like maybe it'll turn out, we don't know yet, that every team that's an esports team in California will actually turn out to have been operating as a talent agency. Maybe they themselves didn't know it, and they won't actually have the proper paperwork for that. And so everyone might have to level up or change how they do things. The question, it goes like this. So I'll ask it to you initially, Bryce, since you rep a lot of the teams. Why is this something we never heard about from you or people around you? Did you yourself know about this aspect? What can you say on that?
The agency law aspect specifically,
yeah,
or the Tfue contract. Yeah, I mean, look,
a mixture of the two.
So, okay, so I'll start with the Tfue contract. Like, I, didn't work on the contract, don't rep FaZe in that capacity, and so had no exposure to the deal.
Have you seen similar contracts in your time, though?
Well, so I've definitely seen similar contracts, right? And anyone who says they hasn't worked in the industry. The industry starts with in particular, in my early days, which is about 6 years ago, I've seen some incredibly egregious contracts. And one of the big things I think I've had a role in doing is leveling up what that standard contract looks like, right? But that standard contract that I've worked on doesn't wind up in the hands of every single team that signs every single player. And also, there's the ability to take a contract which has the potential to be fair, that if you move some numbers around, can be incredibly unfair, right? And so that definitely happens sometimes. It's particularly fun when that happens when they steal my contract and leave my name on the notice provision.
Yes.
So someone reaches out to me about it. But
and not to interrupt, but seriously, I cannot explain how often we get a contract from a team that says Bryce Blum in the notice, and he doesn't rep that team, and they just stole his contract.
Yeah, it definitely happens, because it normally happens in the lower tiers of the organization where the person doesn't want to pay for the contract, so they get from someone else, and then they kind of do whatever they want with it, and it's pretty brutal. So
I've had other attorneys send it with your name on it.
Yeah. I've heard of other attorneys charging for my contract and claiming it to be the work product.
I very much have seen that.
But let's not get too far. Let's not get too far, right? So then, as it relates to the agency law question, Ryan and I are probably going to disagree about this. It's an issue that we've been aware of for a while. It's become more of an issue in the last few years as some of the dynamics and the ways in which teams treated sponsorships changed. Where a few years ago there was essentially no room for players to get these types of independent deals, and in part because of the advocacy of people like Ryan, teams have started to try to find a middle ground and create that space, and it's opened up possible legal risk here. Now, I don't want to start off the show with giving like a 10-minute answer, so I'll try to be really brief, and then if you have follow-up questions, go for it. But look, the reality is we're talking about applying two laws, right? One is the Talent Agency Act, which is at issue in the Tfue lawsuit. The other is the Miller-Ayala Athlete Agency Act. The Talent Agency Act is 40 years old. The Athlete Agency Act is 20 years old. Neither of them, knew fuck all about esports when they were writing it,
of course.
right? And so applying these things can be pretty complicated. Like, Ryan will tell you probably that he thinks the Talent Agency Act definitely applies to the situation. It's worth noting that the definition of artists within the Talent Agency Act, talks about people rendering services in production of motion pictures, radio, et cetera, right? Things that were so far afield from esports. There is a catch-all for people who perform, for artists who perform work in other entertainment industries. And it depends on how you define the word artist and how you define the word entertainment industries and whether or not esports qualifies there. It also depends on whether or not the Athlete Act applies, because if the Athlete Act applies, it preempts, because you don't need registration under both except for under limited circumstances. There's an exemption under the Athlete Act for people acting solely on behalf of sports teams. And the reason is because you don't want to make, for example, the Lakers have everyone who sells sponsorships on behalf of the Lakers have to register as agents, because there's ancillary promotion of all of the sponsors that the Lakers sign, including, logo on the jersey now in the NBA and things of that ilk. So there's a lot of layers to this thing, and there is no concrete answer. And the reason why I know that is because I am staring at a 30-page memo we have prepared on all of the intricacies of this legal issue. And anyone who tells you that there is a definitive answer on this is just wrong. There's no court that's ever considered this. The laws were not written to apply with this.
Sure.
As often happens in the law, we're kind of figuring it out as best we can based on what we have in front of us, but it's not specifically on point.
So there's a definitive answer to this. No, I'm kidding. But in all seriousness, I mean, I do just 100% disagree with Bryce on this. Not that there is a definitive answer necessarily,
sure,
but that these teams are breaching at least one of them. Whatever act you want to fall them, put them under eventually, fine. But I've been yelling for since teams started asking for this exclusive right to be the talent's representative, which is newer in these contracts. Since that's been going on, we've been yelling that this is not okay, that they are not talent agents, they're not licensed, etc. And I think that no matter which act applies, or even if you just want to look at both acts, there is a very easy argument as to why the teams are breaching it. What Bryce said is interesting. You know, the exemption for the Lakers selling sponsorships on behalf of the Lakers, that's okay. No one is upset FaZe is selling sponsorships on behalf of FaZe and using Tfue in those sales, using Tfue as part of those activations or promotions. What I and many others have a problem with is when they're selling a sponsorship for Tfue, just Tfue. They're his representative. And when they're his representative, they're replacing his agent. Oftentimes they're replacing his attorney, and that is not okay. And what happens in those circumstances, this 80-20 rule is a huge step forward. It used to just be 100% to the team, no matter what, even if it was an individual sponsorship.
And then they just give you the salary, presumably, right? Exactly.
And so this 80-20 is a step towards, normalcy, but definitely far off. And I think that's what at least at my agency and my law firm, we have the biggest problem with right now is that teams are demanding to be the exclusive representative, which if you want to get into it is just on its face tortious interference. They're saying, if you sign with us, you can no longer be with Evolve, my agency. That's not allowed, but many teams demand that. So it's an interesting argument with a lot of different layers, but I think no matter how you unpeel it, the teams are not doing the right thing by demanding to be the exclusive representative of these players for individual deals. I have no problem with team-wide deals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So
go on.
So I don't think that's entirely right, but I want to make sure we're unpacking what we're talking about, right? Because Ryan and I are on the same page about certain core elements of this, right? Like team-wide deal, Cloud9 gets sponsored by Puma and every player under the sun who reps Cloud9 is part of the Puma deal. That's all totally fine. And that is the absolute bulk of the esports team sponsorship business, right? We're accounting for 95+% of it right there. So anyone who thinks that like the team model comes crashing down is wrong. In fact, I think, far from being a watershed moment for esports, what this is doing is it's potentially recognizing some legal risk with trying to kind of throw players a bone and create some more space for them to do this. And what you're going to see is teams saying like, we want to do this, but it might be hard to figure this out. It's a legal gray area until we get some certainty and direction from the state and the regulatory bodies about how to handle this. We might just have to say, we're going to go back to old regime where, hey, any deal is a team deal. And by the way, and this is the second point I wanted to make, which is directly contrary to what Ryan is saying about, if only Tfue is acting on the deal, then they must be required to get registration as an agent. That's actually not true, right? It depends on whether or not they're acting in a capacity as an agent or whether or not they're signing an organization deal where only one person under their banner is performing services. So
that's fair. Yes.
If you sign a deal as FaZe and you're not signing the deal for Tfue and Tfue does not directly do it, right? And it's just, hey, we FaZe are going to do an activation with you and this one member of talent or maybe 2 or 3 members of talent are going to be activating against that, right? Then it's actually totally fine. You're not serving as an agent. You can look to all sorts of common law about where that line is drawn, and it essentially has to do with whether or not the principal, which is the person who hires the agent, has control, has higher fire rights over the agent, whether or not that person is essentially acting for them or if they're acting for themselves and you're involved. And there's a landmark case about this, which you guys are going to love the facts on this. It's actually an adult dancers case. And essentially the case was, you have adult dancers that have this hiring agency that was staffing them out to go and strip essentially.
Sure.
And they would take a commission on all of the deals that came through. And there was a lawsuit as a result of it. And what the court said is you're actually not acting as this person's agent, as this adult dancer's agent, you're acting as their employer. And the reason we know that is because the deal was signed at the organization level. If that one person couldn't do it, you could replace them with someone else.
Right.
They didn't have the ability to hire or fire you, right? So there's all sorts of, there's 100+ years of agency law we have to look at too. So it's fairly complex in terms of structure.
But you don't, though, because we're not disagreeing on that. I mean, that again, even if it's a team deal with one person being the main face of it, is fine. But these contracts coming from the teams now are demanding signatory power for the player. They're signing on behalf of the player for the player. A brand comes in and wants to work with just Tfue, and they're negotiating for just Tfue. They don't care if FaZe exists. But FaZe has now exclusive rights to sign that on behalf of Tfue and control whether or not he can do it. That is agency, in my opinion, and doesn't. But we're not disagreeing on where you're saying the line is.
I think it depends on how that's structured, right? Like if saying we're your exclusive sponsorship representative from the standpoint of you can't get any individual deals while you're on this contract. We have paid for the entire bundle of sticks, and there's nothing left over for you, and everything is going to flow through us. That can be legal if the contract is happening at the FaZe level or at the organization level. I said Shay more broadly. It depends on how that deal is structured, how the player contract is done, right? And I'm not going to tell you that I haven't seen examples of contracts that could put this at risk and that make the exemption argument more interesting. But I don't want I want to be really careful about how widespread we paint this problem as, because I think it is getting massively overblown in all the public discourse about this.
And I don't. And and if we want to move on, we can. But
just finish up the point.
Yeah. Last thought on that. I mean, I don't. I do think this problem's widespread, and I think the reason the problem's widespread is because whether or not we figure out this law and whether or not we figure out which side of the aisle teams are on this, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we can have a nice legal debate about it, but it doesn't really matter. The reality is we're getting 6-figure deals, sometimes 7-figure deals in constantly for our top tier talent on teams that are not in franchise leagues. So the team is not much more than a social media company. And in those situations, we have to say no almost every time to our top tier talent because their organizations are not allowing it. And they're saying if they want a sponsorship, they have to come sponsor my organization and pay me, not your talent. And that is the problem here, because the Tfues of the world now are making insane money, getting insane offers. If Tfue says something on his stream, hey guys, come buy this product, that's going to get a much bigger ROI for that brand than if that product just winds up on a FaZe jersey. And that difference is brands are seeing, and they're trying to get individual players deals now going, and they're not allowed to under most team contracts. So the agency argument is a fun one, but almost irrelevant to the actual problem here.
Okay.
Well, just to make a point, if I can as well, Duncan.
You can jump in any time, mate.
Yeah. I find myself in the unenviable position of sort of agreeing with Ryan, and I just want to explain why. Because, I think some of the things he said about the economics of esports are frankly nonsensical. But on this issue, I think his reasoning is absolutely solid. And I think Bryce, knowing a little bit about Bryce's mind, I think he's the kind of guy who actually enjoys a good, robust legal argument. But for me, so just to pick up on the point on the California Labor Code that Bryce made, where he said we need to get into the definition of entertainment, I don't think that's relevant at all. It explicitly says in Labor Code 1700.4b, got it in front of me, that other entertainment enterprises. So other entertainment enterprises is a deliberately broad future-proof term that would absolutely apply to the definition of what streaming and stuff is. Now, on the more interesting side of things, and I've been following this talent agency act stuff since 2015, when Alex Garfield's company Good Game was bought by Twitch, and we could have headed off this problem at the pass if people had listened to my reporting back then. I think the talent agency application is valid here because there was a case. I don't know the name of the stripper case. I'd be interested to get that from you. But there was a ruling in California between Marathon Entertainment versus Rosa Blasi. It's a 2008 case where it said basically in the state of California, a talent, and this is the definition, a talent agent is someone who acts as an intermediary between the buyer and the sellers of talent. Generally speaking, an agent's focus is on the deal, on negotiating numerous short-term project-specific engagements between buyers and sellers. And that was the ruling in that instant where Marathon Entertainment were trying to argue that they weren't a talent agency and the Talent Agency Act didn't apply to them. Now, if you would,
what was the basic premise of that case, by the way, without being
the basic premise of that was Rosa Blasi was an actress who'd been engaged with the talent agency Marathon Entertainment. I think Marathon Entertainment hadn't been satisfactory in representing her, and basically she wanted to get out of the arrangement by saying they had improper licensing. So it was ruled in that case that was the definition in California as of 2008.
And they did, in fact, have incorrect paperwork, basically.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't have it in front of me, and I was reading this a while ago, so if some of the details are hazy, I apologize, but I specifically for this show wrote down that definition of what a talent agent would constitute. That honestly sounds a lot like what FaZe are doing to me and what esports organizations are doing when you sign up. And it's not just FaZe that do this, as my fine legal colleagues have said. Every organization is doing this right now, where they say, hey, we've got a streamer on our books, sign with us, we'll do an engagement for you, we'll do an activation for you, we'll use them as an influencer, we'll take your money, and we'll give the influencer a portion as outlined in our agreement with the influencer, which generally very heavily favors the organization.
So a lot of people have a Tfue-esque, at least, component to their contract in this specific case.
I know Cloud9 have used stuff like this in the past. It goes to the highest level of esports organizations. So I think, the argument about whether or not this is a talent, whether they're acting as a talent agency, is one that, while I think Bryce would enjoy it, and I think he'd be a great guy to argue to the contrary, I think most people, if you were to look at the definitions, would sort of side and say, yeah, that is pretty much what talent agencies do. But I think it's an interesting debate, and I think it's one that needs to happen soon, so we can assess just how big the fallout of the Tfue situation is actually going to be.
Bryce, I remember I think it actually might be the case Richard's talking about, like roughly 2014, when Alex Garfield and the GG Good Game Agency was going to rep those teams, but then they were bought by Twitch. I remember that's around the time when I first heard someone describe the modern day esports team as basically acting as if they were a talent agency. If you looked like functionally what they did, in contrast to a sports franchise or a traditional business, they were more in the vein. At least if you just give that as the gist for a layman like me to understand, it made a lot of sense. It kind of maybe recontextualize how I thought of these teams. Right? In your particular case, obviously the reason why I asked you at the beginning to clarify your position compared to Ryan's is you do represent a lot of the teams, and people are going to wonder in this case, right? Is it a wide open thing? Like this is something that's yet to properly be tested, and therefore it could go either way, could go a million other variants. Is it something that do you have a decent case you can make as to why teams literally aren't essentially talent agencies in this regard? Like, for example, would it be better for most esports teams in California if they indeed weren't talent agencies under the current ruling? What would you say?
Would it be better if they weren't?
Like, will it be more of a hassle if it turns out they are, basically,
Well, if they are talent agencies under the TAA, then they would have to register, right? And so they would fall under that regime, right? There would be certain fiduciary obligations that would apply. It's certainly more complicated than not being, right? Having fewer laws to follow is always simpler than having more laws to follow. I do want to respond directly to Richard's point.
Yeah, sure.
I think I agree with Richard in terms of the point I was making about the definition of artist under the 1978 Talent Agency Act has more to do with the reality that these laws are written at fundamentally different times and places than they are right now.
I totally agree with that as well.
Yeah, and I agree that the definition of artist as it's been interpreted under the TEA historically is probably broad enough to encapsulate some of these things. I think the more interesting legal arguments here are, one, whether or not the Miller-Ayala Act applies, right? Are these professional sports teams, and does the exemption apply? Because if so, right, then you're essentially punting out of the Talent Agency Act, right? The point of the Miller-Ayala Act was to say we need a different regime for regulating athletes in the business of professional sports. And so if that's what this winds up falling under, then even if the law didn't exist, maybe you would have to apply under the TAA. You actually don't in this new world in which Miller-Ayala exists. The second question really is, I think you're making some really good kind of what's the right way to play this? Like plain English arguments about what an agency business is, right? And quoting this case about what it means. I think it's really easy to say when it boils it down to it, right? Someone sourced a deal, this other person did the deal, this first person took a commission on the deal. That's an agency. But the stripper case that I was pointing out, which is fun facts, but really when you drill down into it, it's just a a core legal case about agency law. It says, yeah, okay, so this person sourced the deal, this person signed the deal, this person did the deal, this person took a commission, not an agency. Right. And so it really does matter. There's like a lot of legal nuance to what rights this person, the talent, if you will, had vis-a-vis their, hypothetical agent, right? And who was acting for who and what were the legal rights between these two parties. So that stuff really does matter when we're trying to make these determinations. And that's where, I think the legal arguments gets interesting. But I actually do agree with Ryan, the point Ryan made, a couple minutes ago, where the legal argument's kind of a fun intellectual one. But at the end of the day, this is more of an economic issue than it is a legal one, right? It's about what should this look like?
Yes, absolutely.
And in many ways, from my perspective, the Tfue lawsuit, the legal arguments are almost like a red herring for the economic arguments. It's just the vehicle that he's trying to use to get out of the contract that he views as fundamentally unfair, so he can go make his money elsewhere. So I'm happy to engage in the legal debate, but I'm also happy to get into the economic stuff if we want to do that.
Yes, don't worry. I had some of that planned in light of some of the tweets that have been and gone from certain people's Twitter accounts. So don't worry about that.
I don't know which one you're talking about.
Why don't we then divide it up like that? So maybe we'll do a little bit more on the legal aspect. Like Richard, after sitting through all those pages, again, not as a paid lawyer, not as someone who actually has to do that shit, willingly going through those documents, can you, again, in some kind of a layman's plain English, like tell us what are the concerns here? Like what's different from business as usual for the last 10 years in esports?
Okay, so basically for the Tfue, I mean, this goes back. I mean, let's not even bring up the Tfue situation just yet. Let's talk about when Twitch bought Good Game back in 2015. For those who don't know, Good Game was basically it was representing itself as a talent agency, and it was a way for Alex Garfield to basically have control of multiple team interests, most principally Evil Geniuses and Alliance. Evil Geniuses were a North American team, Alliance were a European team, but also it enabled him to get to his true calling, which we've seen since he's gone to Pop Dog and acquired Loaded and all these other things, which was talent agency. He wanted to help big influencers get value for money. And dare I even say, now that as a former employee of Twitch, and I think it was an acrimonious split, he's going to enjoy perhaps sticking it to one of his former employees now. But anyway, back then, Good Game was saying it was a talent agency. It advertised itself as a talent agency on its website. It literally explicitly said, we'll connect your brand with their reach, which sounds like a talent agency. When Twitch acquired Good Game for an undisclosed amount, it said it was an all-in-one talent and content company focused on gaming and esports, and also said that it has represented players. Now, the problem with that was in the state of California, Alex Garfield, nobody from Good Game had a talent agency license. You can go and check on the talent agency's license database. That's how we know FaZe don't have one.
Neither does he now with Loaded, just for the fun story there.
Okay. Breaking.
Thanks for the insight. Yeah.
I mean, hey.
Sorry, Alex.
It is worth noting, just, Richard's doing a good job laying all this stuff out. Managers and agents are distinct, different regulation. If you're technically serving as a manager, you don't have to. And sure. I'm not saying, I don't have enough of the facts there to say one way or the other, but a lot of times it looks like an agency from the outside, and under the technical letter of the law, you're actually serving as a manager.
Yeah, that is a very good point with Bryce.
Yeah, my agency is the only agency with any license in esports. So it's frustrating to have this argument on that side, and only under the Talent Agency Act, not Miller Ayala, which we're currently pending. But
that was true. But now that you have folks like UTA and CA and WME getting in, like obviously they are.
I meant the not big four fair.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So and just to elaborate on Bryce's point, but yeah, I mean, there is a determination that if you are deemed to be a manager, we go back to that 2008 case I cited where the definitions of what constitutes a manager were outlined as well. A lot of the people who sort of go out and do these deals will sort of look to fall back on that and say, I wasn't a talent agent. I was simply managing talent on behalf of an agency. And that's a very, and as Bryce says, to the letter of the law, you can sometimes wriggle out of it there. Sure. Whether or not the California Labor Commission will be interested in, multi-million dollar companies doing that, I doubt very much. But again, it's a wonderful legal argument to sort of have. So anyway, at that time, I wrote a story saying that Good Game didn't have a license and that this could be problematic because, as we know, if you don't have a talent agency license and you go out and you create contracts between brands and influencers, those contracts are usually deemed void if you don't have the right license. This is I looked at the numbers in about 92% of cases that the California Labor Commission has looked at. They rule that contracts are voided if there's no license in place and it's deemed that you needed a license. So that would have been a huge problem. But because Twitch, obviously an Amazon-owned company, bought them, no one said a word, and it just went away. So we stopped thinking about that law and whether or not actually organizations needed a talent license for a period of about 3 to 4 years, which is where we're at now. Now, in regards to the FaZe issue and the Tfue issue, as I see it, basically, and look, everyone's been arguing about this 80-20 split in favor of the org and all these like unfair terms and all this stuff. It's smoke and mirrors. It's distraction. And I know Bryce and Ryan agree with this. There's no unconscionability argument here on the contract. Tfue's an adult. He's of sound mind.
Sure.
It doesn't matter how unfair the contract is. He willingly entered into it, and that's why his legal team have made zero arguments to that at all, just beyond to say it's a pretty egregious and unfair contract, but they're not pursuing that in their legal complaint because they can't. They don't have a leg to stand on there.
Do you mind if I explain why, though? Because it's actually something I don't think most people know. So to argue a contract, courts are very, very, very hesitant to come in and say a contract's unfair.
In the United States. In the United States. That's hugely different in Europe and other countries.
Yes. I was going to say, in Europe, we do love a bit of that, actually.
That's sure. Right. Yes, in America, we have everything from the business judgment rule, which you can Google, and basically, down to just the unconscionability argument, which courts, it has to be a level you can't even imagine before they'll come in and say that. And this contract is egregious, it's unfair, it's exploitive, but it's probably not anyway unconscionable in a court of law, which is why you don't see that cause of action, and it's not something they're going to hammer.
Yeah. Okay. And then, like I say, I'll wrap it up quick because obviously we should let the lawyers talk about law. But just again to sort of put it in plain English, so the discussion becomes principally, first of all, FaZe not only appeared to be acting as a talent agency because they procured engagements for Tfue. Bryce makes an important distinction. Were they saying, we'll connect you with FaZe and we happen to have Tfue, or were they saying, we'll connect you with Tfue directly? Looking at the verbiage of the contract, I would argue the latter, but again, lawyers are better at arguing these things than me. But then the other point becomes, they not only acted as a talent agency on Tfue's behalf, they precluded Tfue from getting deals himself, which is very strange. Yes. And then it becomes, well, you can't get deals for yourself, but if you do get a deal for yourself, you must refer it to us, FaZe, your representatives, i.e. your agent. So
similar to when I had my agent, you have to send all the deals to them in theory, right?
Yes. And again, you'll see a lot of talent agencies say this, like, if you get wind of a deal, you refer it to us. But generally, you do it because it behooves you to do it. If you've got an 80-20 split in favor of your fucking agency, It doesn't behoove you at all. And then the third part to this also is that, I think there was a lot of non-compete style language in the contract, right? Which is, ignoring the unenforceable, you can't play video games on stream for 6 months bullshit, which is very egregious and ridiculous. And I think everyone would agree it wouldn't stand up. But there was other elements where it was like, I'm trying to think of exactly what it said in the contract, but it was basically, you can't take sponsorships with any company that rivals FaZe's existing sponsorships. So you've got this weird blurring of the line where they're treating him like an employee while acting as his agency, putting behavioral standards on him, putting in place financial limitations, paying him a salary while also saying we exclusively get all of your sponsorships. All of that tangled web, to me, just points to so many red flags as to why this contract is likely going to be voided by a court. So hope that's a reasonable summary.
Ryan, when he, on the last part, he said that, I feel like that's a key distinction to make there, is what the difference will be if someone actually is the agent and if they are, in fact, a team who would have in the past have said they manage you. Like, if someone really, if FaZe, this is just as an example here, we're not literally using that specific one, it's definitely going to be the case. If they turned out to somehow argue that they were just the agent, does that mean, in line with what Richard just said there, they wouldn't be able to do things like put certain standards on how you worked, where you work, what times you do, etc.? Would they have to like be in a very, very limited frame of what they could actually have agency over the person with? Oh, unfortunate word to use, but yeah, what would you say on that?
Yeah, so it's actually the bigger question and bigger argument and fight we had before the agency one was contractor versus employee. And in America and most jurisdictions, because employment law is state-based, method and manner are what you look at to see if someone's an employee or a contractor. The more you control someone's day-to-day, the more likely they're an employee. Yet if you go 4 years ago in esports, every player was a contractor. But come live in our team house. You're not allowed to have guests. Here's all the equipment you're allowed to use. You're not allowed to use your own equipment. You're not allowed to have a girlfriend. You have to be at the gym at 9 a.m. You have to stream this hour to this hour, et cetera, et cetera. Their entire lives were controlled. There wasn't a court on earth that would call these people a contractor, yet they were all under contractor agreements. And that was industry norm. That was industry standard. And that was, as an attorney on the other side, infuriating, but also not something that I could come in and change overnight. You know, Riot and Blizzard changed that overnight by forcing their players to become employees, because once they started going to this franchise model, they realized how ridiculous the current labor relationship was, and they changed it. And that was the norm, though. And, you know, we can scream and rave and rant about it, but it actually turned into a benefit half the time, where if a player wanted to leave a team, all they had to do, I would never do it because we don't make legal threats or anything like that. But all a player would have to do is say, I'll call the IRS and file a misclassification charge. You're going to get your whole team audited for the next decade, and you're going to go out of business. So right away, all right, your contract's terminated, go have fun. We're not going to rewrite the industry. I think you're seeing the exact same thing here with this agency argument. Maybe on a way lesser scale, but to your original point, you know, what can they control and what can they do as an agent versus an employer? It comes down to contractor versus employee. And we're seeing the same bullshit happen all over again in Fortnite, which is why I think it's so important to distinguish the franchise leagues versus the entertainment anarchy leagues like Fortnite, because all Fortnite player offers I'm seeing are coming in as contractor agreements again. Even though it's come live in our team house, even though it's come do all this stuff, it's the same nonsense all over again that I thought was gone.
How many Fortnite team houses are there?
Well, there's
TSM has one, FaZe has one.
Ghost has one. I mean, there's quite a few, to be honest. And then there's a lot of...
Ghost has one. Who else has one for Fortnite
Well, it depends where your line is, to be honest. So keep in mind, I rep the dregs of the industry too. And, you know, there's a lot of that should be the title of this episode.
I know, it's not
clients dregs.
No, we call ourselves that for sure. We're all same page about that. We're the Taco Bell and Kia law firm, and you come to us when you're still there. No, and
hopefully you don't regret it in the morning as much. But okay.
No, not at all. But we no, in all seriousness, I mean, there's tier 2 and tier 3 orgs that are absolutely offering players. All they're offering is a room in a house. They don't offer salary. They don't offer anything, but they'll take 20% of your World Cup money. And that we tell every single one of those players not to sign this. This is a ridiculous org. This is how you become a dreg of the industry and never become anybody successful, because you lock yourself in a 2-year deal like that. But some players, and we're going to talk, I'm sure, much more about this later, about why these contracts are so bad. They're willing to sign anything. This is their first shot. It's the high school band getting the record label deal that's 100 pages long. They're not going to call their lawyer and redline it. They're excited. They sign it. And that's what we're seeing with Fortnite all over again with these terrible contracts, with these terrible, terrible organizations.
Okay.
I have a lot of thoughts, Duncan.
Yeah, come on, give it the download.
Ask a follow-up question. You can.
No, sorry. Actually, you can just pick from whatever they said that you want to address, and then we'll direct it beyond that.
Yes. Okay. So I feel like Ryan's argument's kind of neatly bucketed into two things. One was the IC employee distinction, and the other is kind of what's happening in Fortnite and analogizing the IC employee issues to the agency issues today. So employee IC. Ryan talks about 4 years ago everybody was in a house and they were being told to go to the gym at this time and all this stuff. That's like really not true, right? Like paint esports with a broad brush, right? And it's really, really not true. Now, if you're talking about specifically the LCS, for example. Yes, 4 years ago, most of the LCS teams, I think, in fact, all probably had houses. But outside of the LCS, when was the first team house in CSGO. I mean,
I think it was CLG, and that's just because I think they had an LCS team and they just brought them along, right? So
right, and obviously, some of these things started to follow suit. Some other games started to do this. Some never really did. Right, the team house thing never really became particularly popular in Dota. You're going to find examples of modern Fortnite with houses. You'll find example in Dota and other games. But for a lot of these, it was a really different thing, right? Like if you're talking about an esports player who lives in the gaming house, is coached by the coaching staff, has their entire schedule set. You wake up this time, you go practice this time, you go to the gym at this time. This is team meal, right? All that stuff. Yeah, like if we're focusing on control, right, manner and means performance when you're doing the IC versus employee distinction in most U.S. states, right? Then yeah, like the argument for that person being a contractor is pretty weak. But if it's a Smash Brothers player that lives in their own house far away, there's no they play whenever they want to play, they practice whenever they want to practice. There is no coach that the team hires to set their schedule or say improve in this and this way. They get to pick which tournaments they go to, and really what it's about is like put your logo on your social media, like rep our sponsors on your social media, show up to events wearing our jersey. Like you actually do have a really compelling argument that person is a contractor. So I don't think it's quite as egregious as Ryan was saying. I also think it's worth noting, right, that from an economics perspective, right, like getting back to the reality of why things were the way they were, right, in 2013, there was essentially no esports talent that commanded the type of compensation that could reasonably be compensated, right, and being an employee. There were limited exceptions, but for the most part, if you wanted to play professional video games for a living, right, and the team wanted to hire you, and there was no way that economically made sense as an employee, you kind of did what you could, right?
I'll give you an example. Right now, this is literally the case in me and Richard's field. In the field of esports journalism, if you are basically the entry-level person who just rewrites a news post, you cannot actually currently monetize that news post to make anything approaching like a minimum wage in any functional Western democracy I'm aware of. Like if you were to make them an employee, like it wouldn't actually, the business would have to collapse. They'd have to literally just be paid nothing and be volunteers if we had to make them all employees, basically.
Yeah, and that was the early days of esports, right? And it's still sort of true in some games where like you can't possibly justify playing some small-ish player in some small-ish game, $65,000 a year. And so it's just, if we're going back in time 5 years, it's just would the industry have ever gotten going, right, if we were really strict on these things? I don't think it was any form of abusive maneuver from teams. I think it was just what everyone needed to do to get the industry to the place that it is today. And I think you started to see that transition and that professionalization happen around the 3 to 4 years ago mark. I'm not saying,
but not by choice, Bryce. That's what I would love to hear your thoughts on.
Wait a second, that's just not true, right? Like I guess it depends on your definition of choice. Would they have done
Blizzard and Riot did it. The teams were not making anybody employee on their own free will.
I did those contracts. I did them for dozens of teams. And I can tell you definitively that while there were teams that were still paying people as contractors when those rules started to come into force and effect, there were tons, mostly the biggest of the big teams, because they had the scale, they had the revenue to justify it, they were paying their players enough money, they were going to easily clear minimum wage and overtime, they were going to easily clear exempt employee status, right? And they did it on their own. They did it on their own because I was like, there is legal risk here, right? Like, it wasn't rocket science.
I believe you that you believe that, but as the person representing most of these players, the only team I remember doing it on their own free will, now that I'm really thinking about it, was Liquid. And I do remember Liquid.
You weren't even involved when you talk about free will. You weren't even involved in the conversations between the leagues and my clients, the team. So you have no idea what was being.
This is like one of those Vampire the live action role playing game meetings where they all talk about who sired who in the Vampire clan. I don't know. Come on, then. Let's keep going.
No. Okay, so then, if you're saying the choice was made in a closed room between the teams and Riot and Blizzard, and then the teams did it, fine, we agree. But there was no change until Riot and Blizzard announced it. And the teams, just like Silicon Valley, this isn't esports specific. I do a ton of work in game development. I do a ton of work in tech in general. Everyone's a contractor because it's just easier to do it. You don't have to get anybody insurance. You don't have to worry about California's very strict employment laws. Sure. And it's just what the industry does. So of course esports was doing it too. But to hear that teams, now have the means and are making everyone employees just isn't true. Because if you look at Fortnite again, it's just not true, whether or not they live in a team house.
But wait a second. So it depends on the individual. That's why the reason why I start with that distinction, right? It depends on the individual facts. There are definitely sets of facts where a Fortnite player can properly be classified as an independent contractor, right? Not in California, but if they live somewhere else, there are definitely factual situations on which they could. I don't know enough of the background facts of the Tfue situation to say whether or not this is misclassification. I'm not going to opine on it, even if I did, right? It's kind of not my role here. But the macro point I'm making stands. And by the way, we'll just have to agree to disagree on the transition from employee to contractor, right? Like I'm working with my set of facts, you're working with your set of facts. I happen to be the person who was in the room for the conversation when it was happening. You happen to be
I was the one sent all the contracts.
You were there when they got the independent contractor agreements, and then you were there when the employee agreements started to come through too. You just don't know what was the impetus behind the transformation, right?
I agree with that. I just know that it was a riot announcement and then it started. So
yeah. I don't think the timeline actually comports, but like agree to disagree because there's no way we're going to hash that out on the show. I'm not going to go through 100 old emails from 2000.
Let's do it. Can we hit pause?
Right. So agree to disagree. But the macro point, right, I was making around this is really an economic one, and then you fast forward to today and the agency law comparison, and I think it's a similar argument that to the one I was making earlier. I was really saying, like, I think the import of this is if everyone becomes aware of this legal risk, that it might actually just roll back a little bit, because there's no challenge whatsoever to the notion that team can secure team deal that one influencer works on, and it all depends on how you're legally structuring your contract with player and your contract with sponsor, and that can be 100% legally defensible and not implicate either the Miller-Isle Act or the Talent Agency Act. And I think that's probably where this goes. So I don't actually think it's a net good for players. Maybe the players in the top 0.01%, the Tfues of the world, right? But for everybody else, I don't see how this is making their lives better. And I don't think this is like a watershed moment for players. At the end of the day, it's purely an economics thing, right? Players are generating players going to make X money from team is going to try to generate Y money as a result of that contract, and it's just about how much balance there is there, right? And whether or not it's fair, regardless of where the sources of money comes from. If the team claws back, what a player who otherwise was going to get $50K and additional compensation for deals they were doing one-off, that player just gets offered $50K more the following year, right? This isn't rocket science.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of the team scaling it back and taking away from players, if that's kind of the threat right now, then goodbye teams. There's no more. Well, I'm just saying, if that was brought to my negotiation table, we would not work with that team for sure. There's competitive clubs in esports, and they've been awesome for years. And the Cloud9s, Liquids, TSMs, etc., that go into various leagues or franchise leagues, and you need to join one of those teams to compete. It's a franchise model. You have to be on one of those teams. Sure. Then of course teams make sense. They're a huge benefit. They help with everything from team housing to health insurance to getting you a coach to whatever. But I think what we're seeing happen with this whole sponsorship conversation becoming the main way everyone's making money from talent to team, the talent as more, not even Tfue size, as more tier twos viewership wise get let go from teams or orgs, or they go on their own and instantly start to double, triple, quadruple their income. They realize like, oh, I don't need this team. We don't get 7-figure deals or even 6-figure deals for our tier 2 and tier 3 viewership wise clients, but we absolutely get them deals that are life-changing amount of money to them. And it's getting them more than the $2,000 a month or whatever it would have been for joining a team. What a team used to do and can do still, if the right energy is put on, is grow you. There's a huge argument and debate going on about whether Tfue grew FaZe or FaZe grew Tfue. And I wrote in my article, I think it's pretty clear Tfue was boosted by FaZe, but he was still growing on his own. And the amount of money he had to give away for that growth with FaZe, he would have made infinitely more if he had stayed solo, because he was already trending upwards. And I think as we get more of our top talent in Fortnite and everything else, the conversation's not becoming which team, it's becoming why a team. And that's something that I think that's why this conversation needs to happen. And the contracts from League of Legends that we're just using in Fortnite and everything else right now, they need to be thrown away. And we need to rework the entire relationship and throw out the conversation about who's an agent, what's an agency, and actually just think about what's mutually beneficial in a year-long term between a growing Fortnite player and a FaZe. And no one's having that conversation.
Right, a distinction I've actually seen made, it's kind of in the line of what Bryce said, actually, which basically goes that even though at the time probably most people were completely unaware of all these specifics and didn't know about these alternate laws that could apply to them specifically in this state, even if they had known, it would be very hard in theory to do business at the time. Maybe teams couldn't have existed in the same way, or maybe people, in line with what Bryce said, maybe it meant that people wouldn't even have been able to have certain jobs. Like, actually, maybe you'd have to pay that guy nothing, or I don't know, you'd have to come up with some complicated thing like they do in the Olympics, like put the money in a trust and then years later pay them. I don't know what you'd do, but what would you say to this angle, Ryan? Like, basically, it's kind of like it's not the team saying they fucked up. It's like we just kind of, it was the nature of the business at the time. What would you say to that?
That's reasonable. It is. Like, that's why we didn't bring lawsuits, and that's why my firm didn't make so much noise about the contractor employee thing, because we got it. It's a growing industry trying to create structure. And yeah, unfortunately, though, the same thing I tell my video game developer clients that have a new product that they're releasing, but it has Mario in the background. It doesn't matter. You don't make any money. The law treats you as if you're a billionaire. You know, the law doesn't care if you're poor, rich, or whatever. It's the law. And there is a reality here. We're fine. We can all agree as an industry, this is industry standard because it's all we can afford. Right. But we're past that time. That time's long gone. The orgs are making enough money. I don't want to hear the nonsense about how they're bleeding and they're so poor. You know, I've seen.
You will in a minute, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about it. But you know, I've been to their houses and seen the cars they drive. I think they're all right. And in all seriousness, you know, the orgs are not bleeding, and if they are, it needs to be an internal conversation about why and working that out. But it can't be, oh, well, we lost our Twitch deal. Cool, we're going to take it from the player, and that's industry standard now, and you have to deal with it. You know what Bryce said before was no one, and what your question just was is no one could afford it, so everyone was a contractor. Okay, but we got to the point where everyone can afford it now. Most tier 1 and tier 2 teams can afford health insurance for someone they want to hire, yet most aren't. Keep carving out basically the LCS and OWL franchise teams. There's still a lot of other teams, and most of those don't offer anything, and they're getting worse and worse salaries right now, which I'm sure I'm going to get yelled out shortly about the tweets about falling salaries.
Yes.
But that's true. I mean, there's just a reality that Bryce and I operate in two different worlds of this industry on the day-to-day. Yes, we absolutely negotiate the 7-figure deals in LCS, and we represent over half the Overwatch League and things like that. But you have to understand, I'm open 365 days a year, and most of the deals we work on are not in these franchise leagues. They're in the normal of the industry where salaries are disappearing in exchange for housing rights, or you get to wear our jersey twice a week. You know, and that normalcy, that is what the Fortnite industry, that everyone thinks these players are billionaires. So many stars that are qualifying, so many stars that have, 10,000 concurrents on Twitch. Their fans don't realize what a bad contract and situation they're in. And I don't think Bryce does, to his credit, because Bryce has absolutely cleaned up esports in a lot of ways with this contract he's been doing for the past 5 or 6 years. If you go look at European or Asian esports compared to North American, two different worlds. Player rights here are so far ahead, and that's mostly because Bryce represented so much of the teams, and I was yelling on the player side. Sure. But, in all seriousness, there's not an equivalent to Bryce and myself in any other region in the world. I wish there was, but I couldn't have afforded to do it if I didn't have the game development practice. Bryce came from a firm where he already had a good living and was able to roll the dice with this and run with it a little bit. But it's hard to get in here and clean it up. You talk about teams bleeding and not making money. I mean, think about the lawyers here that we didn't charge people for 4 years.
What about the 4
I know it's a nice angle, but generally no one gives a fuck on that one. I'm afraid.
I'm not really feeling the sympathy.
I'm not saying feel bad for us. I'm saying understand why there's not any others.
Sure.
Why do I represent half the Overwatch League? I don't want to. I mean, that's going to become a conflict eventually. We want to see other lawyers in this space. Bryce and I started, as much as we hate each other, we also love each other. And we started
we don't hate each other at all, by the way.
No,
that's wonderful public drama, but Ryan already didn't have dinner tonight. So
that's right. Yeah. And I get to pay again. So no, I'm kidding. But the reality is we started this Esports Bar Association to try to make it easier to get in. Because as you guys know, the current industry of esports is not very welcoming to business side people coming in and saying, I'm an esports lawyer. No, you're not. Name one person you've ever represented, and that's what we're trying to open up and create a mentorship program to get in there so they can. And maybe this all solves itself with more brains and more eyes in here.
Sure. Right. Before we explore your potential naivety on that particular matter of whether or not teams are indeed bleeding or not, I thought I would ask Richard, as a somewhat independent person within this in as much as he doesn't represent players or teams.
Yeah.
Richard, on that topic, so obviously this does spawn from when Ryan made a tweet. It was back and forth between the two of them where he was talking about whether the contracts were very team-sided, and then Bryce, even though obviously in this particular case, again, remember their backgrounds and who they are. So Bryce came in with the angle of like, he actually explicitly said, like, teams don't make money. And he said player salaries continue to grow far beyond monetization rates. Things that, from the little that I know, I would have agreed with that, at least in my game. Counter-Strike Global Offensive, at the top end of League of Legends, somewhat in Overwatch, as far as I can tell. Is it something, would you agree, which side would you come down on that one before we get into the minutiae?
So if we're specifically talking about that economic debate where Ryan said, I think it was that, salaries continue to fall.
I'd essentially describe it like this. Is it indeed possible that Jack Etienne pays himself a salary from which he does buy that Lamborghini, but also his company loses money? Or is it that, jokes aside, or is it that the teams lose? Basically, are they... First of all, like, are the contracts team-sided in your opinion heavily? Do players have salaries which are out of control for the monetization? Where would you come down on that whole thing?
Okay, so it's pretty broad because there's a lot of bullshit going on, in my opinion.
That's brilliant.
So what Ryan said about player salaries declining, I described that as nonsense earlier in the show. That might be uncharitable, but it's certainly not true in anything I've seen. Generally, the salaries only have that I'm aware of, and I'm aware of a lot, have only appeared to decline in games that have had a huge fucking drop off and disappeared. And obviously, Ryan made a joke about Heroes of the Storm, but I mean, look,
rest in peace.
Yeah, exactly. But if you go and look at the data points, Overwatch salaries are on the increase. I'm sure Ryan would agree with that and probably speak to the franchising system and as being a sort of a driver for that being true. League of Legends recently announced that the average salary was something like $300,000 for a franchised LCS player. Still seems astoundingly high to me, but that is a record high within.
It was also the average, not the median, obviously, on that one. Exactly. So it was always better that I mind everyone.
Yeah.
Hooney might be skewing that a little bit,
Yeah, and maybe Riot Games, are manipulating them.
Exactly.
Just for a change. So I think that isn't true. I think player salaries are going up. I think salaries in general across the industry are going up. That doesn't mean these orgs aren't losing money, though, because if you go and look at the revenue streams that we're getting, we're these big organizations that have had all this VC money, they're getting a little bit too comfortable spending this money on what things I think are frivolous and unsustainable. And I believe, yes, these organizations are losing money. And we shouldn't be looking at the player salaries as the cause for that. If you get 20 million seeding money, if you get a VC spend of 20, 30 million to go out and build various projects, I want to see a complete breakdown of where that goes, because I'm pretty confident I could run an esports organization for a good while on that kind of money. But we spend it on, these big splurges to create more headlines, to create more investment. I'm sure there's a lot of financial impropriety going on. I'm sure there's a lot of mingling of funds going on. I'm sure there's bullshit across the board. I don't think the players should bear the brunt for organizational wastage, which I'm sure there is a lot of. Now, again, when you use the example of a team owner, buying himself a Lamborghini, paying himself a salary from the company, generally it's not the owners either, because the owners get a cut of the equity when these VC companies come in, because it's not just an investment. Very often these deals are structured in a way where you seed vast amounts of control, if not in its entirety, and you are given a employee position. Think Hector over at Optic.
Sure.
He sold a majority share. I think it was like 90% actually, when he talked about it on a podcast recently, of Optic to this Infinite Esports group, who were an absolute joke, and it was told, hey, you'll be on the board, don't worry, 10%'s a lot, you'll have a strong voice. Didn't have a strong voice at all, and has had to watch his baby that he built up from nothing get completely fucking destroyed.
Did sound like baby mind, you just want to use that analogy. Sure, I'm with you on both sides of it, Rich. Yeah,
but again, if you think of it like an adoption, right? Like if you want to keep the child,
right? Sure, okay.
How far
okay.
If it looks all good, and you let the child out, and you're like, oh, yeah, it's going to a good home. It's okay, I can no longer provide
the sentiments
for it.
there,
Yeah, take it to the next level. But if it then turns out there are a bunch of Moloch worshippers and there's a sacrifice about to happen, you might feel a little bit differently about it and try and get the kid back. Just saying. So anyway, when you look at situations like that, it's not the team owners either, honestly. What happens is these businesses come in and it's like fucking termites, dude. They eat your shit from the inside out, and once they're in, you can't get rid of them. And it's waste, and it's bloat, and it's failed projects, and it's incompetence by people that don't understand the industry, like Optic India, or trying to take over all of the Contenders League, which Infinite did and Activision Blizzard were complicit with and perfectly okay with. It's things like that where the wastage goes. Like unsustainable, ridiculous projects. So I agree organizations aren't making money. To blame player salaries for that and players for that, if anybody is indeed doing that, seems absurd. Because generally the one way you can make money back in a very clear, sustainable revenue stream is by doing engagements and acquiring sponsorships for your players and your influencers that are under your brand. Where it starts to go awry is all the other fucking stupid nonsense that the average esports organization thinks they can do once these business types come in. Because I don't really think I've seen a lot of competent business people come into esports and take over an esports org and run it like a sustainable business. I see a lot of idiots with too much money throwing money around because there's no real downside, is there? They're playing with house money. It doesn't matter. You have to understand what VC groups are principally, and that is that they're basically people with unreal amounts of money, so much so they can sit down at a roulette wheel and go, well, I'll put 20 million on 42 and I'll put 20 million on 20, and I'll put 20 million on 30. And if one of those bets come in, they've done all, they get it all back. That's how they think. You have to be seriously incompetent to fuck up once you've got that kind of money in the bank. Now, unfortunately, what we see is a lot of esports projects fail because they don't understand the lay of the land yet. And that's why it's very important that I think these organizations actually do work with people that have been in the industry for a while rather than pushing those people out a la Infinite.
Okay. Right, Bryce, on this one, so Richard made the distinction that he doesn't think it's like salaries because to him, this is the bigger evil, wastage, incompetent business people who are I thought a good point he made there was the idea of like spending money on something that if you actually saw what it was you'd spent it on, really it was like a circular thing. You were spending that to make you seem like you're really successful, which would then make people invest more. And it was kind of like a bizarre logic to it. I can see that someone might be trapped by that, right? On the one hand, can you address some of that? And then secondly, why did you make the distinction about player salaries? Because I do think that's a pertinent topic to talk about in light of the whole initial premise of the podcast. So can you divide those two up for us?
Yeah, for sure. But before I do, I just want to make sure I know exactly what I'm arguing in. So, Richard, you talked about like a lot of overspending and waste, and that makes sense. And I feel like I can respond to that. At some point, you talked about financial impropriety and even commingling. I'm wondering if you can get specific on that, just so I know what we're talking about here before I kind of dive in.
Sure. So what I mean by that is, where you start seeing shell companies within shell companies, VC money comes in. I
can think of a certain European group who seem to have a lot of ownership in different teams and different companies, even websites that cover companies and teams. I won't name any names. It's just I'm throwing an idea out there.
Maybe I'm not using the correct legal term. My understanding always was commingling of funds was where, for example, you had multiple businesses.
Richard, this is what Bryce does. He picks one word out of your entire answer and argues semantics.
No. I mean, which a good lawyer absolutely would do every time.
That's right. But it's irrelevant to the bigger question Duncan asked.
No. Yeah, I want to understand. So commingling. Yeah. Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so my understanding is this is where, you acquire 20 million for this business over here, but you own multiple businesses and, 20 million goes into that one, but this one isn't doing so well. So you take 1 million out of there and you're like, we'll put it back later. And that's fine, So, and I know that this type of thing does go on in esports all the time. They have multiple shell companies under one umbrella organization. The money is brought in on the premise that it's going to go to business A. Business B's having a shit time of it. They take it's all the same people, so who gives a fuck? They take some money from business A, they put it into business B.
Sure.
Are they going to put it back later? Are they not? Who knows? But the point is, obviously, my understanding is that gets into some very murky legal territory.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, it does. And that's actually like spot on definition of commingling. Generally speaking, there's a lot of other examples of it, but it's one good example. And
you passed that one, Richard.
Well, so I'm not aware of any of that behavior.
Okay.
So I was a little confused on what that was referencing. I want to make sure we're on the same page.
No, absolutely. It's important.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have a lot of thoughts, right? So, I think there are independent examples. Like we paint this insanely broad brush, and we've done it throughout the show, right? Like Ryan's extrapolating massive problems, but then gets really specific in Fortnite, and he kind of distinguishes franchise leagues. The reality is like sometimes we operate different levels of the industry, right? It's right. Like my clients tend to be the biggest of the big esports teams, and I represent some teams that are, if we were putting them all on a whiteboard and saying this is tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, right? They're not all going to be tier 1, right? But Ryan does have a tendency to be up here, but also probably have a wider range. I think it's probably fair to say in terms of, average deal size that he's working on, for example. And so some of these problems exist at the absolute upper echelons of the industry. Many of them tend to be relegated to lower parts of the industry or lower economic situations, teams that have not taken on a bunch of venture capital money. It's not just, for example, like, are you in a franchise league, which is the distinction Ryan's using. Sometimes that is it, but oftentimes it's like what is the state of your business, right? Like how much money do you have in the bank? How much revenue are you generating on an annualized basis? And these are the criteria for me that kind of matter more than just like, are you in a franchise league? As well as the economics of an esports team, and I have so many thoughts, right? I've dealt with this not just as a lawyer, but as a consultant, and I've probably looked at more esports team P&Ls than probably anyone on the planet, I would guess, right? And look, there's no way I can sit here and argue there's never been waste from an esports team spend, right? There for sure has been waste, just like there's waste in tons of different businesses. I'm not aware of commingling. That is a serious accusation. To the extent that is a rampant problem, I am surprised because I'm unaware of it.
I wouldn't say rampant. I wouldn't classify it as a rampant problem. I think
it was just something that is known to happen on occasion.
Yeah,
right?
but
when we're talking about
heard things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And look, in the industry, we certainly know of bad actors. There are teams that I don't work with for the reasons that I'm sure anyone on the show would happily, be or very much aware of, though we're probably not going to like name names and put people on blast for the purpose of this. Right. But, go ahead.
No, it's fine.
Don't.
Called your bluff.
All the dregs anyway, so.
The dregs. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, look, that's not surprising. I think, from a macro perspective, right, we're talking about esports team health and what is going where, right? Like franchise fees are a big expenditure for esports teams in the modern ecosystem, right? So where a huge chunk of the money is going from. I don't think your example, Duncan, of like CEOs collecting, like, oh, my business is losing money, but I have like this $1 million paycheck and this Lambo that I get, right? And I get a new Lambo every year. Like, I don't actually think that's a problem. I'm not aware of any examples that exists. I think, has CEO compensation gone up in the wake of investment? It absolutely has. By and large, these are people who were compensated like next to nothing for a really long period of time. And the first time I met Steve R. Hanset, right, the co-CEO of Team Liquid, he was living in the Curse House with 14 players. And he started his morning every day at 6 a.m. washing dishes after them and taking out the trash, right? And then he was serving as middle management and upper management. And I don't know how much money Steve made then. And I actually don't know how much money he makes now. But I promise
he's not Jeff Bezos now. It's not like he's that crazy a scale.
This is not a corporate greed situation, right? This is not a situation where like teams are like, quote unquote losing money because the CEO is just like sapping money out of the business. That's not something that's happening. All these investors would never let that happen, right? These guys are receiving reasonable compensation for how much an executive makes in a business of their size and scale, right? And you have a ton of third parties that are directly interested in that, because when you're an investor that pours in $20 million, the last thing you want to see is your CEO pulling out $1 million a year, right? They would never let that happen. So I don't think that's an example of real problem. Waste is, and there are examples of esports teams that have overspent, that have wasted a lot of money, right? I think it's the exception, not the rule. I think if you look at most of the biggest, baddest, best esports teams right around, you're going to be hard pressed to point to them and say like that was an insane amount of waste. Sometimes they go for standing up new business units and they lose money on them, right? And it's all about continuing to try to figure out how they can grow and scale, right? Like esports team monetization, as we've talked about, is relatively narrow historically. And so when an esports team, like for example, Immortals Gamers Club buys, gamers, right? And they say, we're going to try to build this ancillary business, right? That can leverage our brand MIBR and our talent, right? Like, and we're going to try to create other revenue streams. For me, that just makes sense. Do sometimes these businesses do things and they don't work? Yeah, but that happens all the time in business. I don't look at that and say this is an esports problem. I don't even look at it and say it's a particularly pervasive problem. We can all point to examples, but I think if we were to run big team by big team and say, hey, like Ryan and Richard and Thorin, like give me examples of waste existing. What is the level of waste at Cloud9? What is the level of waste at Team Liquid? What's the level of waste at TSM, right? And on and on. I think we would actually struggle with many of these teams. And for much of them, right, these ancillary spends tend to be really good for their business, right? Like TSM has its litany of websites, right, that do very well for them, right? Team Liquid has One Up Studios, which does very well for them, right?
Sure.
There's a number of, not to mention the pedias, right? Their army of pedias. So I don't think that waste is a particularly huge problem either. I mean, if you're looking, you could argue that franchise investments are a bad investment, and if we want to have that debate, we can have it. I get why they have come up, and I get why some teams are betting on them. So if you look at team profit and loss statements over the last few years, revenues have absolutely gone up. They've gotten much better at monetizing their media rights. They've gotten better at monetizing their sponsorships, right? Like there have been more non-endemic deals announced in the last year than the previous 36, right? Like look at just what TSM, Cloud9, Team Liquid have announced in the last 6 months alone is crazy, right? So they're definitely getting better at monetization. Player salaries, though, contrary to Ryan's world, but in support of literally everyone that I have talked to in this industry, including the two of you, other player representation, people who work with teams, people who work in the organizer phase, like literally no one has come to Ryan's defense on the argument that player compensation is going down. I think it's just honestly, that argument is just so far diverse from reality. I'm kind of tired of engaging with it. I do think there's very fair arguments to make about where the value is, right, for teams versus players. If you look at traditional sports teams, most of them do not make money, right? Like most of them are a vanity asset that appreciate an enterprise value annually, but lose money every year, right?
Yes.
And I think whether or not esports teams should be analogized to sports teams is a fair debate to have, right? But I don't think we can look at these teams and say like, it is true, as you guys have acknowledged, that like for the most part, teams aren't turning a profit. I don't think that's because of commingling or fraud or massive, waste or anything like that. I think it's just the economics of running a sports team are difficult, particularly in a landscape where player salaries continue to balloon as they are. I am not, to be clear, I am not saying like players are to blame. I'm not saying that teams are, we should all feel bad for these teams or anything. Far from it, right? Like they're growing in enterprise value. They're able to continue to get investment. They're able to grow their businesses. Some of these owners have been able to take money off the table, right? Their compensation at the executive levels have been able to go up, right?
You can still succeed without the company itself making a profit.
For sure. It's a long-term bet, right? Like even if you never took money off the table, which many of these owners have not, by the way, many of them have not taken meaningful money off the table yet. They're still betting on their future and this large chunk of equity they have that they hope is going to turn into millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars someday. So I'm not crying poor, but I am saying when you look at the economics of this thing, right, the rising player salaries have had a profound impact on team economic health. In terms of ability to turn over year over year, which is creating a model in which there is increased pressure to go to these VCs that it seems like everyone on the show hates, right? That like taking this money, right? It is a little bit of a catch-22 here, right? If you want to continue to pay these increased salaries and compete in the market where other people are paying these increased salaries, you need to get an influx of capital in order to be able to spend on this talent, right? The hope is that everybody's winning, that players are getting incredibly well compensated, that team businesses continue to thrive, survive, raise more money, get to profitability, whatever it is, change hands for millions of dollars as they do in traditional sports all the time. It's a really, really complex economic argument, and one that's hard to have in a vacuum, and also one that's hard to have at the 50,000 foot level because every team is different. And I would probably agree with, Richard on some examples of teams that have been poorly managed, right? I probably don't want to get to that nuanced level. It's possible some of them are clients, right? But there are definitely arguments on all sides that are fair. I'm just trying to make sure people understand the broader context in which this is all happening.
Yeah, and I just want to say as well, just in regards to the VC thing, I do speak about them, pretty negatively, on a lot of occasions. It's not so much the VC money that I hate, because I think it can do a lot of good for the industry if spent correctly. What I typically hate is the fact they send in their sort of own enforcers into the esports space, and they think they're the ones who are going to be able to dictate what the best spend is. It's like every time Mark Cuban opens his mouth and talks about esports, and everyone rushes to write up what his thoughts are. It's like, why are we listening to this fucking guy? That'd be like me going into investment banking and and the world of finance and going, guys, I got some great ideas. I get fucking laughed out the room. So I think we need to be very careful about a lot. It's the people that come with the money I don't like so much.
And it depends.
Not the money itself.
There are examples of those people that I would agree with you on too, but then there are examples of people that come in that really spend a lot of time learning about the space.
There are. Yeah.
Right. Like Ari Siegel, for example. Right. If anyone's going to say a bad word about Ari on this show, I'm prepared to go to bat for Ari in every sense of the word. Right. That is a guy who came in, was very humble, understood that he had a lot to learn about this industry before he was going to start. He came in and he listened and he asked questions. Right. And over time he learned. And it turns out he's an incredibly smart and capable person who had a background that was a little different from esports, but that has proven enormously valuable in terms of how he's been able to help Immortals grow, how he's been able to transition to a CEO role. And I think there are other examples of Ari, right? Maybe he's the low-hanging fruit, but yes, there are examples of people that have come in that did not learn, that did it the wrong way, that did waste money. No disagreements from me there.
Right, Ryan, there's two parts. So one is the part that Bryce.
I'm so proud of you.
By the way, I appreciate also. Well, yeah, go on.
You just to point out, because I'm sort of trying to keep time as some sort of secondary host. You're on 25 minutes before we get the hard out.
That's okay.
Yeah, and I can bump my 3:00 if this
that's okay.
We're enjoying it.
That's fine. Here's the thing. I noticed that when Bryce was giving all his part, he also explained by we don't need to discuss that part anymore anyway, because obviously that's delusional. The part about Ryan said so, but you have to have your chance to speak on that. So first things first, what did you mean by the comment about salaries in the industry plummeting? Because here's the thing, right? I noticed earlier when you hinted at it, you said something along the lines of excluding the franchise leagues. But to be fair, you did say it in your follow-up tweets. Oh, not excluding, right? Well, that's what I want to get to, because you did say in your follow-up tweets that you aren't talking about tier 3 orgs. You're not talking about just nobodies and people out in the middle of the stick somewhere. Presumably you're referring to teams, I'm not specific ones we're going to name now, but teams we would know, even maybe players that are at a level we might watch if we watch esports games. So what do you mean by that the salaries are plummeting? Because you made it sound like it was a trend across the industry.
Well, okay. And first things first, it was like the 17th reply when Bryce and I were just arguing at 1 a.m. on Twitter.
Okay, right.
He means the 17th reply less. It goes down. The 16th reply,
it had
15, the 14.
It had 12 views until you two assholes started showing everybody.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. I do like to just here's the thing. I don't even like to sometimes comment. I just like to retweet it and just go, let's get everyone else in on this shit, shall we? And I'll just sit back.
No, but in all seriousness, it's part of a bigger conversation that is hard to summarize in 140 characters. But what absolutely happened and is happening is valuations skyrocketed for teams, but profits did not. So they got all of this money, and then a lot of the tier 1 orgs went around and offered insane salaries to players that they wanted. And now in years 2 and 3 of that cycle, they're coming. When I said plummeting, I meant back to earth, not to the below. And that is happening. We saw insane offers. I mean, I can't mention, that's a big problem here too, is of course, you'll notice on that thread, every single team owner and, Marty from Splice came in and yelled at me about it. I don't rep anyone on Splice. I don't know their numbers. Well, no, I like Marty a lot, but I don't know their numbers. That's fair. But there are, and it's not a bad problem. The owners where the salaries are coming back down to earth aren't the problem for the most part. I mean, it's just, the reality is that when those salaries skyrocketed, they took 5 other things in these agreements. They took more IP rights. I have teams asking for personal Twitch donations and sub money. I have teams asking for insane things right now.
I mean, I'll just say, I know from the player side, from all the players that I was friendly with, etc., most of them didn't even think about that. All they thought about was as long as the salary number was high, they would give anything. They would sign anything at that point.
Totally. But now that's become industry
That's believable.
Standard. Yeah, and to give all that stuff away is industry standard now.
Sure.
But now that the salaries are coming back to reason, and not poor. None of these players in these T1 games I'm repping are poor. The ones I don't rep are, though. If you look at Overwatch League, if you look at most players' contracts that are not rep by me or another agent, they are 50, right near that floor. And I don't have all the full data on that, but I know from how many players come to our agency begging to renegotiate that they're damn close to the floor, if not the floor. And that's a truism across esports, I would imagine. Again, I don't have access to the numbers of the players I don't rep in League of Legends, but I would bet my ass that Barry Lee, our League of Legends, our director of esports and League of Legends agent, when he negotiates a contract, that salary is substantially higher than if that player was unrepresented. And again, I don't have those numbers. When we hear a 300,000 average salary in LCS, I can't stop laughing at that because I know how many players got 7-figure deals that skewed that, and I don't know what the actual average is.
Sure.
So my whole thing is, if this is such an easy conversation, and if it's so obvious, Bryce calls it a publicity stunt, but I think it's good for everyone. Just put the contract out there, show the salaries, make this more like the traditional sports we're all trying to mirror in these franchise leagues. Just show the numbers, and then we don't have to have this debate.
Just a quick point about that, right? I mean, there's arguments on both sides, isn't there? Because obviously you create a huge industry ripple if, like, it turns out some very mediocre player is getting a huge fucking salary, and it goes
Which is true.
Right. I have no
Almost
doubt
certainly,
that it
And these players get massive hate in other sports, like they're like the tank contracts and everyone just
totally true.
But the reality is, I think in a franchise league, I think you kind of almost to be fit for purpose. I think your contracts need to be explicitly stated. I think on a sort of free market, on a tournament circuit where it's completely open and you pick and choose what events to go in, not so much. But when you're in a hermetically sealed franchise league where it's the only place you can play, it does strike me as weird that developers, well, I mean, it's not weird. I know exactly why they're doing it, but it strikes me as odd that the developer doesn't come in and just say, we're going to put all player contracts in a database. So you have the start dates. So there's no poaching, no tampering. Everybody can negotiate in good faith. And we're going to include their salaries in that. So players get a better idea about when they go to the negotiating table, which teams provide a better offer for them. I think in Overwatch League, it should be happening. And I think people like Ryan should very much be the agent, again, no pun intended, of that change. If they're not already
By the way, just to quickly clarify, Richard's implication there was that the reason why the game dev doesn't do that is because the person that would hurt the most is probably the teams, who would then have to all level up the money they were paying, because we would find out which mid-tier people got paid more. And at the moment, the main person that the dev who runs a franchise league wants to please is the person who just bought in for $20 million, not necessarily the guy who gets paid $20,000 and should get paid $22,000. I mean, that was basically the implication he was implying.
But we've seen it.
I'm happy to double up that. Yeah, for sure. And part two of that tweet and that conversation and describing it further was the response to that was what games. It's not games. It's what orgs, what teams. Because if you take an org that got a huge boost and went nuts, that was across all of their games. And then they came back down in all of their games. So yeah, Heroes of the Storm was obviously a joke, but it's also tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. You felt that ripple of this, whoa, and then back down to earth. And that's where we are now with a lot of them. But again, no one's poor or crying. My salary is not the argument I'm making on these player contracts. What is my big problem is how many hundreds of thousands and millions that we have to turn away as an agency for a handful of players because their orgs won't let them take those sponsorships. And I think that the reality is the future of this industry is brands are starting to realize that people are fans of a player, not always a team. And that player can, Thorin, your channel gets more views than some leagues out there. You could go out and sell a product better than those leagues. Individuals have fan bases. And yes, teams, of course, do. Of course, there's TSM fans. Of course. But these mega stars, these Tfues, these people like that, you think Tfue's fan base is going to stay with FaZe and tell him to go to hell? No, they're going to follow him. The people that watch him every day love him. They don't care what logo's up there. So those brands and sponsors want to work with him or people like him, and they're not allowed to right now. And that's a nightmare. And that's what I am making for sure the main point of this. So that salary comment, again, way down a chain and way not enough facts in how I presented it. I agree with Bryce. I don't think it's the point worth arguing here. But the sponsorship stuff is, and I really want to make that super important. Sponsorship rights and media rights and IP rights, basically the three things. IP you can even put into media a little bit, but those three things players have no control over. It's league or it's team, and that needs to change as this industry grows. It's just not sustainable otherwise.
Okay. Right. How about this then, Bryce? We'll make that like the last focal point. That'll be the last topic. Is essentially, it's kind of like what value does a team bring, and therefore what value should players negotiate relative to how much the overall pie is, right? So the question goes like this. It's basically an abstract version of what you said at the beginning. Like, did Tfue make FaZe, or did FaZe make Tfue? And therefore, who should get the bigger end of the deal? How should it be valued, right? So I know depending on which background someone comes from, you can argue either side of that case. Like with certain individuals, I can think of some individual, I won't name them right now, who I don't think would actually be huge streaming stars, etc., without that initial boost that you get from being on a TSM, a FaZe, the big orgs that can get you that instant fan base. But there are definitely people on the other side where they might have stayed with one of those orgs 2 years too long, and they already were at the point where, to Ryan's point, maybe they could have made like the 6-7 figure deal just themselves instead of basically unknowingly giving like maybe 60% of that to their org, who might have just done a very simple negotiation someone like Ryan could have done for them if they'd have known. What would you say on this angle? Because obviously Ryan's going to argue the player side of it. What would you say on the team side? What value do the teams bring that they should be able to command what they currently get or something similar in terms of value?
Yeah, if it's okay, I want to respond just quickly on the
last sure.
Because Richard and Ryan both weighed in on it. I mean, the really fast. I'll try to make it short and sweet. It's hard to argue with Ryan on the player salary issue because it's quite frankly a moving target, right? Like what he is saying on this show is fundamentally different than what he said on Twitter and what people called him out on. And I get, I actually
you can go look at it.
I'm literally looking at it.
I'll read it.
Right. So I am reading it. And you drew broad sweeping conclusions. The nuance you're drawing now about, I was saying they were coming down, but really I meant they were coming back down to earth. Like they're now reasonable. Right. And it's an individual org thing. Like, these 3 orgs went down, but everything else, like that just wasn't the point you were making.
Okay. Then how about this? I concede that point forever. Salaries are skyrocketing and everyone's a billionaire. You win.
Okay, I feel great about that. Like,
great.
Okay. Right, and then the other point, right, that I wanted to quickly respond on.
I don't know if I can handle lawyers arguing about hot take versions of their own argument. That later on they obviously had to condense down into a reasonable point. Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
that feels like diminishing returns on that one. But yeah, go on, Bryce.
for sure. Right. Okay, so to get to your core point, right, around esports teams and
it is basically the future of the industry, as Ryan said. So yeah, go on.
And the public salaries thing, really quickly. Like, I'm actually for it. I see the net benefits outweighing the net cons. I think that you'd be surprised that some people go the other way. That like some player who's making $300,000 a year right now in the LCS, other team's going to look around and be like, wait a second, like the jungle talent out there that's available, I could have gotten for half. And like, is this player really worth it? So,
and if I'm the last player to sign a jungler, and I know that that's what's left, exactly. I can see the certain different angles it would benefit the team too. Sure,
for sure. So, and different sports do this differently, right? Like European football does not publish salaries, right? We talk about this like this is some traditional sports thing that they all do. It's just not the case, right? Like the only European football numbers that are reported are leaked and never verified, right?
Yes,
so it does depend sport by sport. I'm fine with the salaries becoming public. At the end of the day, it's just everybody involved has to want to do that, right? And there are definitely, by the way, there are team clients of mine that would not want their salaries public. There are player clients of Ryan that would not want their salaries public, right? And so it's an interesting dynamic in that regard. Whether or not it happens or not, I don't think.
Well, that's a union conversation in general. The top 1% of any game gives up a lot to help the other 99% when you form a players association or union, because they have the power to do that. So of course, there's a couple of people at the top that wouldn't want to share with everyone.
Or that's people in the middle who just are probably, quite frankly, being overcompensated and don't want everyone else to realize that they are being overcompensated. Like they'd rather their team not know, they'd rather other players not know, right? Like,
yeah, but the teams all talk and share salaries, which is why those middle tier overpaid players are coming back down to earth, as I said.
Players do too, though, right? Like players,
players do also lie a bit more. I think.
I mean, like
but players never tell the truth.
Which is why I said
yes.
The Overwatch League player Discord had a leak sheet of their own salaries, and I don't think I dated half of them. I don't think there was a single accurate number on that list.
Yeah, teams do the same thing though, right? Like
probably.
It's not a set of perfect data, right? But I actually don't think there's much of a disagreement there. I'm fine with it either way. I am probably slightly pro releasing the salaries. To the core economic point, right? And this is something Ryan and I have engaged on a lot on Twitter and our recent article back and forth, right? Like I just think of this as the free market, guys. Like at the end of the day, the teams are bundling for a certain bundle of sticks. Maybe you could argue that 3 years ago or whatever, they didn't read the contract at all. Not that many players were represented, whatever. But like Ryan's players are represented, and well, there are other agents in the space. Like these people are starting to be like, there's now lawsuits. It's all public, right? Everyone knows what the things they have to care about are, and they do care about more than just salary numbers. Oftentimes, they're willing to cede other rights or cede possible upside in exchange for higher guaranteed compensation. right? And that's just the reality. And if players want to go out and prioritize the things that Ryan really cares about, if they care about it as much as Ryan does, then when they get to the negotiation table, that's the stuff they need to prioritize. And I'm not saying, by the way, that literally every team is going to be open to that discussion. Some teams are going to say, I only want my sponsorship model to be everything exists at the org level because I'm really good at selling these sponsorships. I know I'm able to make money on it, and I'm only interested in players who are willing to buy into that model. But there will be other teams, because it will be a market differentiator, it'll be a way of them attracting talent, who will be more than open to that conversation, right? I think it's a be careful what you wish for situation, right? Some of these players are going to take 50% compensation in exchange for the independent rights to deals and then not make up that delta and find out the team was better at selling that part of their rights in conjunction with everything else than the individuals were. And some might go the other way, right? But like Ryan paints this like it's some like obvious net win, right? Like that the second these guys get these rights back, they can go and do it. That like he has all these.
Not everyone's
like,
Tfue, right, Bryce?
Yeah, like very few people are Tfue, right? The number of players that exist at scale in this industry are tiny, tiny, tiny. For the big brands that deploy real dollars, they have no interest in working with someone who's like total combined following is 500,000 followers across all the different platforms.
I'll give you an analogy. So Bryce and Ryan cleverly used me as an example because in the esports journalism world, I would be in the top 1% and I could probably sell my brand for more than whatever site I work for. But again, the people who are my mates who started 2 years ago will make 10 times more working for a big site than they ever will if they try and go and market their labor, individually and try and get someone to negotiate for them. So I'll just give a contrast there where I can kind of see where you're coming from on that one.
Yeah. And look, the reality is, yes, could you go and get deals for most of these players, right? Any player that's in the LCS, for example, or Overwatch, like for the most part, yeah, you get them some kind of deals. They're going to be relatively small deals for a lot of them, right? And a lot of big brands or really any brands are not going to be that interested in working with talent that's at that scale right now. Will that change over time as the average scale across the industry increases? Of course it will. But for the most part right now, the number of players that can garner these types of significant deals are very few and far between. What's so hard for me about this argument is that Ryan talks about the player salaries coming back down to earth, but the problem is the salaries came back down to earth and nothing else changed. Well, of course they didn't, right? They were being overcompensated, so now they're being, if in these rare examples, right, they're now being appropriately compensated, but that's appropriate compensation in light of all of the rights that they are giving up. If they want to get some of those rights back, they have to give up more money. That is how the free market works, and it's so.
And you say that like anyone's against that. That's what
Ryan,
no team. Show me a client of yours that would be willing to give less salary and give my player his full sponsorship rights. Name one.
Wouldn't the argument be though that if they do so, they kind of give up a competitive, equal playing field with their rival team that doesn't give up the rights? I mean, I realize again you could negotiate for all the teams or whatever, but
it goes both ways though, right? If you're some team that, let's say you're a team that's constantly losing out talent in some game because, like in League of Legends, for example, there's an inherent bias where players want to compete on behalf of Liquid, C9, and TSM because those are the guys that make worlds, right? And so players are willing to take salary cuts as in traditional sports to go there, right? They want to win so badly they'll go there.
It was basically recently revealed that Cloud9 and TSM players, relative to how good the team is, were making way less than Team Liquid, for example, because Team Liquid had tried to overspend to get all the absolute best, and then C9 was basically able to benefit from exactly what you're saying. Like, people thought being on C9 was worth getting a little bit more and being on, we'll pick a random team, it's Echo Fox,
Yeah, and I won't. I mean, the dynamics of the industry are such that in different games, there's a different Cloud9, TSM, Team Liquid, right? And it depends. But just as in traditional sports, not every deal is created equal. You care about where you live, you care about who you're going to play with, you care about how likely you are to win, you care about what the work-life balance could be, what the culture is, who's coaching, all of this kind of stuff matters, right? So, there are other teams that could create a separation from the market and entice talent to come to them by doing this if talent really cares about this. And I'm honestly not convinced at all that talent really cares about this. I think
can I jump in
front of them?
Yeah, come on.
Yeah,
because here's the thing. You're arguing the history of esports, and you're right in that this problem is as old as Fortnite, but it affects all games. But in non-endemic brands, when they started reading all these Fortnite articles, Ninja really changed this. Where
you can tell Ryan's done a lot of media recently. He's got a lot of great slogans. Have you noticed that? Like that one's a brilliant one. Like it's as old as Fortnite.
I almost want to vote for him.
It's like I'm supposed to just take that immediately, put that like blown up in the middle section of the article, like between the text parts, next to a picture of him as he said. Yeah, go on, keep going.
I'm good at soundboards. Salaries are plummeting.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, Ryan's always been good at PR. I've always been good at.
You cut out. I couldn't hear what you were good at.
Yeah, what did you say you were good at? What did you say you were good at?
Oh,
we didn't hear the actual word. Yeah.
Oh, damn! I thought it was a joke, and you guys were trolling me. I joked. Ryan's good at PR. I'm good at substance.
Right, there you go. The irony was that is what she dropped out. We didn't hear the word substance, so.
But in all seriousness, so think about your grandmother or whoever. They heard about Ninja on the news every night. They heard about blah 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 every night, and all of a sudden, my agency that was cold calling brands and begging people to work with our people like Hooney or Cypher or Siegel or people like that, begging. Brands didn't care about esports. The Ninja stuff happened, Fortnite exploded, and now they started calling us. And so this problem is a newer one. And to act like I'm arguing on behalf of players that 3 years ago were fighting for only salary, you're right. I totally was. But as these new contracts come in, this is going to be a war that I don't think the orgs are acknowledging or ready for, because they're just saying this is how it's always been done. This is how it's always been done no longer matters because the game has changed.
Are those brands picking up the phone and calling you about about Hooney now, or is it just about Cypher and Fortnite?
Well, no. To be clear, I can't say Hooney, and I don't want to talk. I shouldn't have even said his name.
It was just an example, of course.
But it's for sure all games, all tier 1 games that have provable numbers and metrics. And I think a big part of it too is that a lot of these orgs were raising, and they went around and perked a lot of ears up in VC world that didn't invest, but they worked with the brand. So now they want to get in esports this way. Whatever it is, the phone and email, they're nonstop about working in these different games and figuring out how. I don't think a sponsorship for the Overwatch League I do think that's going to be infinitely more expensive, but I don't think it's going to yield more results than taking the top 5 players and doing individual sponsorships with them. It's just how I feel. I think our internal data shows that, but I don't know the data Bryce has. I don't know the data.
I have no idea how you could have internal data. I mean, saying it's how you feel is fair, right?
Well, we use affiliate. I can tell you, we use affiliate links, and we show specifically who tracks what.
But you have no access to the Overwatch League's data.
Well, maybe they're lying to us, but the brands that do both tell us, wow, this was way better. We're going to do this only from now on. And it's happened numerous times. And
I mean, that sounds like confirmation bias, right? Like the people who are loving working with your clients are saying, we love working with your clients, right? I just want to be really clear about this, right? Because we've had
very few, if any, that honestly, I mean, you can go look at all my clients' tweet histories, very few, if any, failed campaigns that have not turned into long-term campaigns. Most start as a one-off where they come in and dip their toe in the water, but you can go see my clients with only a few thousand Twitter followers and no YouTube. They're still getting brought in because they want to hit all angles, all demographics. And that is where people want to spend their money now. They'd rather come to an agency like us and package a deal around 100 esports clients throughout all different games rather than go to one org and put their logo on a jersey. It's just, you can argue the data and metrics all you want. It is common sense obvious that is going to yield more results. And the reality is
that's just not true.
I know you don't agree, and we don't agree here, but
don't say it's common sense obvious. Just say it's your opinion.
No, I think you're the only one who disagrees. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, everyone else.
No.
To give 100.
How about I just start listing brands that have sponsored esports teams in the last 6 months, right? They all disagree with you. Otherwise,
they didn't do their research, or did Puma try to represent individual players, or did they just go and take a team? Because that's what everyone does. People who are doing their homework and coming to us and speaking to us, they can see and track and easily move around. This player's not working. Cool. We'll move to this one. And now we have results. And regardless, the argument of
at the risk of making this last too long, because obviously we have to rein this in some degree. I'll just very quickly ask you this one pushback, right? The pushback goes like this. In the example, so we'll use that specific example, the Puma example. As a lay person, but who knows a little bit about the industry, my guess there would be the reason why Puma isn't sponsoring Tfue, but might have sponsored FaZe, is because FaZe can get in the door to actually talk to Puma, whereas I doubt they actually really do know Tfue, and that's, like maybe that's so high up the chain that they don't get impacted.
I don't know, honestly. I just wanted to chime in just a little bit, and then I'll go back.
Sure,
to enjoying this meeting of minds. The reality is, I think again we'll keep Puma as the example. Is the reality that they go and sponsor a team and not Tfue, and they definitely know what Tfue is. They definitely know who a Ninja is. changes. But what they have to do is they have to start picking apart who the fuck do I talk to. And in the case of Ninja, sure, he's an influencer, got out of his Luminosity contract, became independent. Most of these big influencers are still under contract with an organization of some sort, not truly independent in that sense. So they have to go and talk to them because that is the point of entry. And to Bryce's point, I agree. I would love to see a world where players are getting independent sponsorship deals in exchange for less salary, because that would stimulate the growth of agencies, the need for agencies, the work for agencies, and result in better deals for players. And actually, the best players and the players with followings, not even necessarily the most talented ones, would find themselves making more money than the current situation right now.
That is totally true.
Organizations do not want that, because players to them, for the most part, are walking billboards. And the reason that salaries have gone up, the reason that salaries are kept artificially high, even in games that are dying, which of course contradicts Ryan's point, is they don't want to give up those rights, because, they want a $1 million deal from Sennheiser, right? Because that's where the real money is. And if you represent a team, that's where your cut is. Not in getting a player a $20,000 sponsorship deal. The player would be way better off in that situation. The organization isn't. And what they do is they nudge you into going, but what if you don't get a sponsorship deal? And it's orgs wanting to have their cake and eat it. They want the players to be walking billboards. They want to own their image rights in perpetuity. They want to be able to market them. They want to be able to use them for all of their advertising purposes. And they go out and get these huge deals, and there's very little trickle down to players in the current system.
I don't know how that's...
And that's why it's Bryce's point, but it's not Bryce's actual reality. There's no team that's going to make that trade-off with us right now. And again, it scales. So a player who's making $2,000 a month doesn't need a six-figure salary to lose some salary and make a better sponsorship. I have very few players who would make less money in that situation. Almost all of them, because we get our guys with very little following sponsorships. Richard's point is so spot on that it's the exact issue and why this is all happening. We get these sponsors coming in the door. We have to tell them no, and then they go and talk to the team that they have to talk to get the players they want. And that problem is why we're seeing team sponsorships and not player sponsorships. Of course, there will always be team sponsorships. People sponsor the Yankees, but they also sponsor Jeter. They also sponsor the players. And we have to get there, or this just isn't sustainable. You're never going to have a player happy in his contract once they achieve success. These contracts are not exploitative on day one. Maybe I would argue they are. Bryce will argue they're certainly not. But fine, let me concede they're not on day one of signing. I would say they're all proposed to be exploited. Either the player underperforms and he's no longer worth that salary and we cut him and he's gone, or he blows up and then he's trapped here for the duration and he doesn't get a benefit. He's stuck at his normal crap salary and we're going to yield all the results. That Tfue situation happens hundreds of times throughout the past few years, not at that level, of course, but hundreds of times. And that's what's driving us crazy at my agency and law firm and the other people in this space that try to come in and be agents for players. They don't last long because there's no money to be made unless you have those connections. We went in a JV with ICM, the third biggest agency in the world. The reason we did that is because they can get Puma on the phone and we can't. But what happens is we get to their junior level marketing guy, then we get to the head of marketing, whatever he is. But by the time they get to their board or the actual signature on the check, they say, what is this video game nonsense? No, go away. Or they say, this is awesome, let's do it. And then by the time they get through the pipeline, they wind up going to a team because that's the approval metrics right now. And it's just easier for them. So that can't last.
Okay. So, right, Bryce, I have to go in a minute or two, but just give us your final thoughts on this.
Yeah, I have a lot of final thoughts, right? Like when Richard says his team's having their cake and eat it too, I don't actually know what that means. Like it's teams saying these are the rights we want, right? This is the offer we're willing to make you and we're willing to pay you for these rights. And the players can say yes
just
or
to
no.
clarify, what I mean by that is, it's what they offer isn't necessarily commensurate to the money they make on the flip side. It sounds like a better deal to the player because the salary is more and even inflated in some cases, but it isn't. The org is still making money on that deal. What they lose on the salary by offering more, they make up on the ability to basically use the image rights of the player to get these big sponsorships.
I think when done well, that is true of literally all business, right? Like, every employee that is hired in any business anywhere in the world is hired with the intention of the company being able to extract more value out of that employee than they pay, right?
Not at this scale, Bryce. And you said it's free labor and free market. So was, exploiting child labor 100 years ago. We need regulations
that is
and laws
such a disingenuous analogy, and you know it, right?
Right at the end
Ryan,
as well, right before the bell.
You talk about like these
I think we're out of time.
You talk about these contracts like it's like all esports player contracts. Like, are you going to sit here and argue that like the tier 1A Counter-Strike player, the tier 1A League of Legends player is like being exploited? Like, this is someone who's like has the potential to blow up and be like much bigger, and so we don't know. Like, the reality of these contracts is the market is dictating how much value they think they can generate out of this person as a result of having them on their team, including the sponsorship rights, right? And
that CS:GO is a weird example, though, and you keep going to it, and that's the only. It's one of the only esports left where people are trying to win. Instead of becoming media.
What I've realised from this conversation is this is just round one, not only of their own battle that will never end, but this needs to be done again. So maybe what we'll do is we'll do another one. Who knows? Maybe this time, Ryan, I'll give you the proper Royal Rumble treatment. I'll bring in an owner as well, and I'll argue on some of your side if you want. We'll make it fair in that way, But we'll do it again, shall we?
I am definitely down to do it again. If I can leave it at this, right? Like, everything that Ryan is asking for, everything we're talking about, is a matter of contract, right? It is a matter of an arm's length negotiation in which his clients are represented, we would hope, well by him, right? If this is actually something players want, if they do think they can make more money, if this is something they're prepared to go to the mattress over in negotiation, that is literally Ryan's job, right?
And so if the system,
if the system is broken, this is something that naturally fixes itself. I don't think that it is. I think actually these guys are being fairly compensated by and large. I think Fortnite is an outlier in some situations. Some of these contracts Ryan has told me about, which are not contracts that my clients have done, they do sound egregious. They do sound like they're primarily moonshot upside for teams in exchange for little in return. But we paint this as like some broad problem that like these people are being exploited. And I just think that's constantly lost in the shuffle here. This isn't 4 years ago when players didn't read their contracts, didn't have representation, didn't know what could be done with them, right? We live in a different world. And if this market evolution is really as important as some of the people think, like, we're going to see it happen. It's not something, this is why I say the publish the contracts is kind of a red herring. That's not really what this is about, right? Like, if these people want it, they'll go out and they'll advocate for it in their negotiations and they'll get it done.
And they can't because they get opportunities pulled because they're told that's industry standard. That's how it's done. Get out. So that's a red herring.
Yeah, no, it's not, right? Like,
at the end, maybe the red herring was the friends we all made along the way in this discussion. So that's the end of this episode. We'll do it again. We'll probably just start right there. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Butt Pounder 420, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Wendelful, Chi Mao, JDubs, Alexander Rao, Blunt Smoking Anus Destroyer, Daniel Olivar, NateDOhDoubleG, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, and a special thanks go out to Jerky's Minion and weixz. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you'd like to ask me a question in my monthly AMA. Do you want teasers for my upcoming content? See who the guests are. Maybe you'd like to take part in a donator discussion with me on video. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at link in the description box below.